Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are studying out of the book of Acts, and we're talking about characters out of that book. And we've been trying to kind of just look at these individuals. We've talked about Luke and Theophilus a little bit. We spent some time with Peter last week. Tonight, lesson 3 is concerning which individual? Okay, Paul. We normally call him Paul. He's first known as Saul, and particularly Saul of Tarsus. And it's interesting, isn't it? We always kind of associate him with the location from which he was from. We can't even begin tonight, really. We're going to use the lesson sheets that we've been going through, and we're going to use it as our map and guide. And so we'll talk about the things that are listed within those lesson sheets. There's so much more that we could talk about as it relates to the Apostle Paul, the events and circumstances he finds himself in, the differences in relationship to the work he's doing. But we're going to try to stick to this roadmap and talk about the things that are listed here for us, because that's what we prepped and made ready for as it relates to our study this evening. But Paul's a great study for us because we're first introduced to him where? Okay, so Acts chapter 7, verse 58, and that's question 1, by the way, on your lesson sheets as well. But the question simply was, on what occasion do we first meet Saul of Tarsus? And we find him at the stoning of Stephen. Now, if you recall, Stephen preaches a pretty scathing message, and he basically tells them, and you can go through that history, but basically Stephen tells that Jewish audience, you don't remember your history very well. If you knew and remembered your history better, you would be believers in whom? In Jesus. You would be a believer in Jesus if you would learn your history a little better. But they had rejected it and turned aside from it, and so that creates a problem. Now, I would hope that people would have better sense that when they heard something they didn't agree with, that they would just what? Walk away. But that's not always the case, is it? It wasn't the case in the days of Saul of Tarsus, and it wasn't the case even today. And people tend to get angry and upset and even violent and challenging when somebody disagrees with them, and that's not necessarily a good behavior. So much so in this circumstance that they were so mad at Stephen that they raced at him, gnashing at him with their teeth, and picked up stones and stoned him to death. What was Stephen's disposition, by the way, real quick? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He uses the same language that Jesus used on the cross as it relates to that. But we find Saul of Tarsus. What's he doing during this? Okay, so he's holding the coats of those who chose to pick up stones and stone Stephen to death. Do you think that this scene, the question was asked, was he on the victim's side? No, not at all. He's cooperating in this sense as it relates to these things. If you jump to chapter 8 of Acts chapter 8 and verse 1, it simply stated that Saul was consenting unto his death. And so, by the way, do you have to pick up a stone to be just as culpable in that circumstance? No, you don't have to pick up a stone and start hurling at Stephen to be just as responsible for what happened. And you and I maybe need to learn a lesson from Saul of Tarsus here, that you don't have to become an active participant to be just as guilty of what's going on. You consent to sin, it's the same. It's the same. And Paul isn't excused, Saul of Tarsus isn't excused here because he didn't happen to be the one picking up the stones. He consented unto the death of Stephen. He's just as responsible for it. But what kind of impression did it make on him? Okay, so what did he determine he needed to do from that point forward? To be the active participant, right? He might have been the guy holding the coats when Stephen personally was being stoned to death, but Saul of Tarsus leaves that scene determined that he needs to become an active participant in challenging all believers in Jesus Christ. And he leaves that scene committed to that end and the purposes that he would drive towards from that point forward. What is the result of Stephen's death, by the way, as it relates to disciples? They're scattered. They begin to leave where? How long had they been there? Okay, fair enough. Well, Okay, so go back to when did they first start becoming Christians? Pentecost. How had they gotten to Jerusalem, or where were they from? All over the place. They had come into Jerusalem to celebrate Pentecost. They learn about Jesus the Christ and how they're obligated to Him. Thousands are responding to that gospel. Normally, when you would come to the feast, you would be there for the feast, and you'd do what? You go back home. But you just learned this whole new conversation. You learned this whole new concept and idea spiritually, and so you stuck around in order to listen to the apostles. So there's a pretty good pocket of believers that are residing here in Jerusalem. Back you up just a little bit further. What happened, or what did those locals end up having to do in order to accommodate all those that stayed? All right, they were having to drum up enough finances in order to be able to support all these individuals that stayed, even to the point where they were willing to sell properties. That's where that scene of Ananias and Sapphira comes out of. My point, friends, is simply this. Up until now, disciples, Christians, were concentrated right here in Jerusalem. Stephen's stoned to death. Chapter 8, they scatter. Saul's a witness to that, consents to it, thinks it's a good idea to continue it. Then later, and I think it's question 2, I don't think I'm ahead of myself here, but the question was out of Acts chapter 9, how did he occupy his time? Interesting way to ask that. Okay, so he's breathing threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord unto the high priest. And here's what I want you to notice. And desired of him letters to Damascus, to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, whether they were men or women, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. Now think about that. It wasn't content enough for Saul of Tarsus just to drive them out of Jerusalem. He creates a scattering. After the death of Stephen, he swears out these threatenings of life and limb towards Christians. They do what most people would do in that circumstance. They scatter, and he decides, I can't let them scatter. I need to do what? I need to pursue them. And I'm trying to simply illustrate that's how vehement he was, that he was doing the right thing. He was so confident that he was doing the right thing as it related to those followers of Jesus, those who had become disciples of Jesus the Nazarene, that he was willing to go to the high priest and say, listen, I need your authority. I hear they've run to Damascus. I want to get down there, and I want to go into the synagogues. Why the synagogue? Okay, that would be the general meeting place. And so that's typically where you find even Paul, later on in life, when he's the Apostle Paul, you'll find him going into different towns, going into the synagogues and having discussions with people as it relates to the faith in Jesus. So he decides to pursue them and take them back to Jerusalem. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah. Yeah. So the question that was asked, and let me reiterate so everybody can hear it, is do we view Paul and those leaderships, or the leadership among the Jews, as radical because they're not content just to try to stop the message, they're willing to put people to death over that message, and do we consider that radical? Now go ahead, Ken, I think you... And I suppose, Bob, maybe it depends on whose eyes you're looking at it through. You look at it through our eyes, I think we would say, yeah, that's pretty radical. There potentially is this concept that they viewed them as blasphemers against God, and so and really in some ways that's kind of their mode. Jesus condemned them lots of times about their hypocrisy, where they would hold the letter of the law when it came to certain matters, but when it came to their own personal conduct, they weren't all that worried about it. But at least with this case of Saul of Tarsus, who becomes the Apostle Paul, I think in his later words, and I think when we look at him here in a little bit in our study, he kind of acknowledges, listen, I was doing everything that I thought was right. Yeah. And though it was radical, he was convinced it was the right thing to do. I have a little more respect, and that sounds like a strange thing to say maybe, but I do have a little more respect because the Bible reveals kind of the integrity of Paul, whereas there was no integrity among those leadership, among those priests and others. Their willingness to bend the rules and bend the law to meet their means, or so they could use any means to meet their purposes, is pretty evident. But Saul seems to have a lot of integrity about him. He's convinced he's going on the right path, and so this is what he's going to pursue. When he learns something different, he changes. And we'll see that before we're done. Yeah. And there certainly is a zeal within him that whether right or wrong, whether misguided or not, it's definitely there. And you see that same passion when he learns about Jesus or commits to Jesus and turns the other direction. Yeah, and I think that's true, Jim. I think they did convince themselves that they were doing the will of God. And there's some lessons, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that, a little bit later in our lesson. Good questions and thoughts, I appreciate it. So what event then caused Saul to consider being converted to Christ later in Acts 9? Okay. He has to come, in a sense, face to face with whom? Jesus himself. And some people use the phrase, you got to come to Jesus moment. Saul of Tarsus had a come to Jesus moment. Literally. As he's heading on to Damascus, he literally encounters the Lord. Now, does he initially recognize that? No, I think although you wonder what's going through his mind. You know, he's making some connect. But he falls to the earth and hears a voice asking him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? In verse 4. In verse 5, he said, Who art thou, Lord? Who are you? And Jesus specifically speaks to him and says, I am Jesus whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to what? To kick against the pricks or the goads. What were those, by the way? Yeah, like a cattle prod, right? And they were sharp sticks. Generally, when you'd have a team of oxen and they were pulling a cart or pulling a plow or whatever it might be, you would have goads. Anytime they would want to back up, the goads would hit them and keep them moving in a forward direction. And so Jesus says to Saul of Tarsus, aren't you getting tired of hurting yourself trying to go backward when everything about the Old Testament law, when the prophets, everything that Jesus presented is pushing you in the forward direction, not backwards? What I've always appreciated about this is basically Jesus says, Paul, you know what's right. You know what's right. It's hard for you. You're resisting and causing personal injury to yourself, knowing what's really right in this circumstance. You need to rethink this. And he is trembling and astonished. And he asks a very important question. What is it? In the middle of verse 6. What do you want me to do? What do I need to change course? What do I need to do to change direction? How can I improve this circumstance? Friends, those are great questions to always ask spiritually. It's not enough to acknowledge that there's a problem. I could talk to you for hours about folks who always talk to me about the problems. It's hard to talk to folks sometimes that want to talk about solutions and answers and resolve. Paul had a spiritual problem. They needed to address it. What do you want me to do about it? He asked. Go ahead, Amy. Absolutely. And you see him change. He had purpose in mind when it came to persecuting. He comes at it with the same purpose in mind when it comes to making the change. And same resolve is used here. What's he told to do, by the way? Go into Damascus and you will be told what to do. Okay, so the instruction that came from Jesus, go on into Damascus and somebody's going to come and tell you what it is that you need to do in order to resolve this. What's interesting is that Saul of Tarsus, though God has great purpose in mind for him, though he's going to begin to fulfill the role of the apostle and specifically really take that message to where? The Gentile world. And yet he's still subject to what? The basic obedience to the gospel that anybody else is. So who's he find when he gets on into town there? Okay, that's question 4, and you find it in verse 10. He comes to a fellow by the Ananias. Now, is Ananias a willing or an unwilling participant? Okay, it depends on when you're talking about it, right? Initially, not so much interested in that, right? Is that legit? I think so. Lord, don't you know about this guy? Don't you know? I'm not so sure that's the right path for me to take. He had heard and knew the purposes of Saul of Tarsus. So he gets a little nudge, if you will, and he goes and fulfills the purpose of bringing Saul of Tarsus the gospel. Even a man like Paul had to do the same things you and I need to do when we come to Jesus. Ananias talked to him. Eventually we learn out of Acts 22, Saul, Saul, why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized, washing away thy sins, calling upon the name of the Lord. The same message that was intended for every single person who wanted to come to Jesus. Ananias delivers the exact same message, and Paul reiterates that or tells that story or account of that happening in Acts chapter 22. So what amazing fact do we learn in verse 22 of Acts 9? Okay, so Saul increased the more in strength and in knowledge or understanding and confounded, what's another word some of you might have in your? Proving, confuting, some translation says. I think, and the reason why I say that, because when we think of the idea of confounding, we think of what? Puzzlement or they're not confusing what Paul's saying, right? They understand it clearly, what Paul was saying. They may not like it. They may not want to, but he's confuting with it. He's proving why this change took place, why it is that he felt necessary to make these choices and decisions. And they're dumbfounded by it. Not so much what he's saying, but the fact that the same guy we heard was coming here to Damascus to send these disciples of Jesus packing on back to Jerusalem is now the biggest spokesperson for him. Yeah. And when people make drastic changes, we tend to what? Take notice, but we also tend to do what? And it's going to lead us into the next conversation. We tend to question it. We tend to doubt it. We don't generally think of people making that drastic a change without some what? Some ulterior motive. Is that kind of what the Christians are thinking when he heads back into Jerusalem? Yeah. They're not so sure about this. They're not so sure about this change that supposedly happens as it relates to Saul of Tarsus. But go ahead, I'm sorry, Kent. Right. There's no doubt they know who. So when he comes back, what's it take to kind of ease that? It takes somebody, right? It takes a man like Barnabas who had respect among the people to put his integrity on the line and say, I know of what happened with Saul of Tarsus over in Damascus when Ananias spoke to him, and the changes that have been evident in the life of Saul of Tarsus. We need to receive him. I have said 1 billion times, it feels like, in lessons and sermons. We need more people like Barnabas in our lives. We need more people who are willing to honor and serve others by standing up for one another and defending one another. And as brothers and sisters in Christ, we need that as much as well. We need to know that there are going to be people who support us and encourage us and help us when we're challenged, when we're troubled, and when maybe somebody needs to stand up and say, you know what, I know what he was, but I also know what he is right now. And I know what he's trying to do with his life now. Paul was a mess. Saul of Tarsus was a mess. He considers himself later in the narratives of Scripture what? The chiefest of sinners. Big problems in the past of Saul of Tarsus. But he makes the change and he needs somebody to step up. And Barnabas is that guy. So once that happens, what do Paul and Barnabas begin to do? Okay, travel and work together. And they take what we often call the what? The first of the missionary journeys, the first preaching tour that Paul makes. Now, we find that Paul and Barnabas have a little bit of a problem. And the reason for that is described in Acts chapter 15. First trip went successfully, not without its hardships, but they fulfilled the first trip. They're now thinking about doing another one, and they're trying to decide what? Who's going? So Barnabas determines to take with them John, whose surname was Mark, but Paul thought it wasn't a good idea to take him with them, who departed from them from Pamphylia, and went not with them to the work. So the problem is, we're going to make this next trip. Barnabas wants to take John Mark. We know, if you add Acts chapter 13 as well, that in the midst of the first journey, John Mark decides, I don't know about this, I'm going back to Jerusalem. And so Paul and Barnabas have a pretty heavy discussion over the decision. And in fact, read verse 39. I think it's important. And the contention was so sharp between them that they departed asunder one from the other. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed unto Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and departed, being recommended by their brethren unto the grace of God. Here's what I want us to appreciate about that. Sometimes we get into our minds that the Lord's body is going to be this pristine grouping of individuals that just are happy and is contented and get along with one another all the time, 24/7, 365, never a challenge or difficulty or hurdle to overcome, and that in West Virginia Ease ain't true. It's not always like that. Should we strive for that? Yes. Should we work very diligently to maintain the unity in the bond of peace? Yes. But sometimes people can have not just a disagreement, but a strong, sharp disagreement. Now, here's the beauty of this. They could have just kept what? Arguing. He should go. No, he shouldn't. Oh, I'm not allowed to use that arm. Sorry. Forgot. Got to hold that arm still. I'll tell you about that later. But Rachel will laugh at me now because I'm injured myself preaching a Bible class. But anyway, you get the point, right? They could have gone back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But rather than do that, and it couldn't necessarily be resolved in some kind of, well, okay, it's just, there's no reason to argue about this anymore. You take John Mark and you go one way. Paul says, I'll take Silas, we'll go another way. And what's the beauty of that, by the way? Twice the work gets done. So they realized. Now, did they stay mad at each other forever? No. No. They don't stay mad at each other forever. And eventually, and we'll see that before we're done here, some resolve happens. But John had left in that first trip, and Saul of Tarsus needed people around him that he had confidence in. So the secondary question, question 7, was, do you think this decision is in keeping with the character of Paul? And in what way? Okay, so Paul had high expectations for himself, and generally speaking, when you have high expectations for yourself, you tend to want others to come and meet that expectation as well. In what other ways, maybe? Okay, maybe his confidence maybe is bigger in Silas than in John Mark. How as it relates to the character of Paul? Okay, he's kind of a no-nonsense guy, and let me add to that, he's purpose-driven. He's got work to do, and he doesn't have what? Doesn't have forever to get it done. There's work to be done, and I need to get to it. And my best option is not to take a guy along and put confidence and trust that may get broken again. Now, the beauty of this is John Mark doesn't get tossed to the side. Barnabas takes him, and he gets used for the purposes of God. So it does seem to fit. And so the second question then is, what do you think it was justified? Yeah. Paul, that's right. He didn't call John Mark's Christianity into question. All he called into question was John Mark's ability to go on this trip, particularly with Paul. I want us to remember that. I'm not trying to be critical. I think we could evidence this just by looking at the history, and if we had more time, we'd dig more. But the trip with Barnabas is not going to be nearly as challenging or threatening as what Paul's going to experience. And so John Mark's going to be put into a circumstance where he can work and help and aid in a different kind of approach than what he was going to experience if he walked alongside of Paul. And so Paul, in some ways, is trying to, in a sense, put John Mark in a circumstance where he can succeed. My point, friends, that we can learn from that is not every aspect of work in the kingdom is meant for everybody. And sometimes the best thing somebody could do for me would be to say, that isn't your niche. This might be your niche. That might not be the best approach for you. This might be something that you could have greater success at. We don't like to do that, right? Because we don't want to hurt what? Right? We don't hurt anybody's feelings. But Paul's not trying to hurt John Mark's feelings. He's trying, number one, to fulfill the purpose that he's been given to get out there and preach the gospel in some pretty challenging circumstances. He's got to take people that he can rely upon along the way. And he also, in the same breath, puts John Mark in a circumstance where maybe he can find a role that he can fulfill in that different capacity. We're not all meant for everything. We're not all meant for the same purposes. That's why the Bible repeatedly speaks about the body being what? Fitly joined together with everyone supplying their part. And sometimes encouragement maybe need to come in the form of that direction isn't the best for you maybe. Here's a path that might work better in terms of your service to God. And I think that's what happens here with John Mark and Barnabas. In chapter 20 then, he asked the question, if you flip your sheets over, at least I think yours flip at that point. Question 8 on the lesson sheet. How could Paul have said that he was clear of the blood of all men when he had been standing there consenting to the death of Stephen and wreaked havoc on the disciples after that point? Okay. Okay, so he was fulfilling the purposes that God had assigned him to do as it relates to the gospel. Yeah. The context of thought here isn't about did Paul consent in an earlier moment to the death of some. The context is anybody that came into contact with Paul knew what they needed to do as it relates to the gospel when he got done. And he's not guilty of any consequences that might fall to them because of that. That's the context of conversation here in this narrative. Yeah. It included people in places of authority. It included anybody that he would come into contact with. He spoke to the chief rulers of the synagogue the same way he would a man he would encounter on the street. And that was important to him to fulfill that purpose. So why would it sometimes, question 9, be a trial to declare the whole of God's word? Okay. So it isn't easy, and there's things that could put your life in danger and other things. The specific challenge in 2 Timothy 4 is what? People don't want to listen. People don't want to hear it. People don't want to pay attention to the guidelines. They would rather hear what? What tickles their ears. What word is used in King James anyway? They don't want the truth, they want fables. There are some people that would rather hear a lie if it sounds better than the truth if it's challenging or motivates or holds somebody accountable. And that's really at the challenge with the spread of the gospel more than we realize. Some people reject it because they'd simply prefer to hear something, even if in their mind they know that's not true. They know they couldn't find a Bible verse to back it up, but it's more comfortable. And so they would rather, and it's been going on since the days Paul wrote this to Timothy, continues to go on today, where people would prefer things that sound easier to them and don't compel them to any responsibilities, and where no accountability is offered or extended, and they just kind of go on their merry way. Trouble is they won't hear the gospel. No, you're good. Right. They're not just wanting to hear things that tickle their ears and are untrue or fables. They're actually promoting and inviting and exalting teachers who will do that for them. And so it's not just a matter of what they want, it's a matter of what they're providing for themselves. And that's a challenge. Yeah, and that's the rebuke, reprove, exhort with all long suffering, in season, out of season. That's doing holding the responsibility of sharing that message, regardless of the responses to it. So after persecuting Christ, then, how could Paul claim in Acts 23, verse 1, that he had lived in all good conscience? Okay. So, at the time he was doing it, he's fully persuaded that that's what he should be doing. Now, there's kind of a twofold conversation we can have here. But notice, when he speaks to this council, when he's being charged with some things, he says, listen, I've lived in all good conscience before God until this day. While he was a Jew among Jews, an up and rising star among them, sat at the feet of Gamaliel, the great teacher. From his wreaking havoc among the church to his conversion, during all that, I have lived in all good conscience before God, fully convinced that he was doing what is right. Now, what I appreciate about him in that, at least I can respect that, right? At least I can respect somebody who just commits themselves to what they believe is right, and they're living that. Particularly somebody with that kind of passion and commitment who's willing to do what when they learn something different to make change. When they're willing to make the change, when they realize that that passion and that zeal that they've had towards some direction isn't what they should have had, Paul is willing to make change. Give me a zealous person any day of the week. Maybe that's just personal preference, I don't know. But give me somebody that's passionate about what they believe, will be loyal to that, but who's willing to be taught and educated, and when they see that path isn't right, they'll take that same energy and that same passion and that same zeal and put it in the right direction. By the way, that's kind of the principle that's taught in the book of Revelation, isn't it? When he said, I wish that you were what? Yeah, either hot or cold. But don't give me the lukewarm. Don't give me that, kind of mushy, wishy-washy, not so sure approach. Give me hot or cold, the Revelator said. Paul said, I've answered. But that also tells us what? Your conscience can be what? Can be wrong. And your conscience can't always be what? Yeah, the guide, the end-all answer. It's exactly right, Bob. The conscience has to be taught, trained, and educated. And that's a continual process. There may have been lots of things that at one point in time that you or I might have done with all good conscience. And now we look back and go, you know what? I don't know that was the right choice or that was the right path. And we choose something better because our conscience is constantly being taught and trained. And we approve upon it. We're not going to be perfect. Saul of Tarsus wasn't perfect. But he was willing to be trained. And he's willing to let that conscience be educated and trained, particularly as it came to the Word, the testimony of Scripture. So is it possible then to live sincerely and conscientiously but still be wrong? Yeah, Paul's proof of that. Paul's absolute proof of that. I want you to quickly look. We've got just 5 minutes or so here, but I want you to, let's go into these texts in 2 Corinthians, and I want to quickly look at them because I've always been appreciative of Paul's willingness to endure so much to do what was right. And so let's start in chapter 4 of 2 Corinthians, chapter 4, verse 8. We are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, cast down, but not destroyed. What I love about the Apostle Paul here is he's very encouraging to us to realize that we may not be able to avoid every hardship or challenge or even things that perplex or create difficulty for us, but we don't have to let them win the day. Paul said, I've been in some deep challenges and problems, but I don't let them win the day. Verse 23 of 2 Corinthians 11, are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool, I am more. And labors more abundant, stripes above measure, prisons more frequent, deaths often. Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods. Once was I stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils of waters, perils of robbers, perils by mine own countrymen, perils by the heathen, perils in the city, perils in the wilderness, perils in the sea, perils among false brethren. Paul couldn't go anywhere or be around anybody without a problem. Everywhere he went, in every person or group of people that he seemed to come in contact with, a problem would occur. And along the way, he's also dealing with what? The physical stress of all that. Verse 27, in weariness, painfulness, watchings often, hungry, thirsty, fastings often, cold and nakedness. And besides all that, I wish I could get my faith and my confidences to that level where I could list all of that and say, and besides all that, right? As if that list wasn't enough, besides all that, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. That's just my day-to-day existence. He said, I didn't stop doing the work. I don't know of any of us that wouldn't give Paul a pass here, right? He comes to us and says, this is what I've been going through. We'd say, Paul, take a break, right? Take a rest. But that's not the passion that he has. He's willing to endure all that because of the work that comes to preaching and teaching. And then in chapter 12, we learn about what? That what? That Paul had. Right? The thorn in the flesh that he had. So Paul gets in trouble everywhere he goes, among everybody he comes in contact with. He's got all the wearisomeness of all the churches, the weight of all that matter. He's got a personal ailment, a physical ailment of some type that he continues to pray about 3 times. And yet he keeps enduring. His conversion came at a great cost. Go ahead, Gary. Yeah. Yeah. His hope never left. Even though he may have felt a lot of times where there wasn't much rope to hold on to at the end of all that. Yeah, and just quit. And you're right, Jim, but yet that wasn't the example he left for us. Determined to finish. So quickly, as we're running out of time, how many books of the New Testament did Paul write? Okay, so it depends on whether you count that. We know that he wrote 12. If you add Hebrews, he wrote 13. Add them up for me unless I'm missing one. Did I miss one? Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon, 14 if he wrote Hebrews. All right, so 13 definitely wrote. 14 if he wrote Hebrews. Lots of debate about that. But the point basically is this. He wrote most of it. He wrote most of it in terms of at least the letters and the writings. He spent his time a lot in writing. Did he get along with John Mark later? Yeah, so much so that when Paul has this kind of farewell address, if you will, within his letter to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4, who's he asked for? He says, send John Mark to me. And that's that same text where he talks about, he'd done what? He'd finished the course. He'd kept the faith. If you go over into 2 Timothy chapter 4, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, I'm going to use my pen quit working. When he gave him those instructions to preach the word and reprove and exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine, warned him about the turning away of their ears. But notice verse 6, for I am now ready to be offered. The time of my departure is at hand. I fought the good fight. I finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them also that love his appearing. What did it say? What kind of crown would he receive? A crown of righteousness. Paul was willing to endure all those things because he knew there was a great reward coming. And his ability to stay focused on that reward and stay focused on those promises is what carried him through all those difficulties. The crown of righteousness was more important than the hardship that he was experiencing on the way. And that's what we need to do as well. To stay focused on those promises, stay committed to those promises, and the benefits that come to us because of that. Any last quick thoughts as we finish up? We could be. He's probably calling him brother because they're fellow Jews. They're fellow Jews, and so they're in the. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I didn't look at that, but I didn't, I didn't pursue why he would say brother. I don't. I think there's probably just a connection. I would still contend probably more related to kindred, because they're of the Jewish descent, heritage, is what I would. Well, and again, I mean, that's absolutely, it's possible that because Ananias recognizes that he's already been accepted from the standpoint that he's the one God wants. Paul's still got his responsibilities in all this, but Ananias knows this is the one that Jesus chose, and so he could have a spirit of connectivity to him by that point already, in assumption of what's coming. I guess I never really thought much about why he called him that. Right. I understand. Yeah. Yeah. Although it's interesting. We say that, Jim, but and you're right. There's certain characteristics that we all ought to adopt and learn from him. But the beauty of it is, it's not just Paul. It's Barnabas, and there's Silas, and there's John Mark. There's all different characters, and that's kind of why we're studying this. And all of them equally as important and great lessons from. But certainly, if we had his integrity of faith, we would improve.